Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be looking at some short games that White was able to win with the first move, b4. This is a relatively uncommon opening, often called the Polish, Orangutan, or perhaps most fittingly, the Sokolsky Opening. White is aiming to put the dark squared bishop on the a1 h8 diagonal as quickly as possible. This is somewhat similar to the Nimzo-Larsen. However, instead of pushing the pawn to b3, we're playing a little bit more aggressively for queenside space by pushing the pawn one square further to b4. This is a very fun opening, one of my personal favorites, and it's been played on occasion by some of the world's strongest players, including Magnus Carlsen and Bobby Fischer. It ultimately can lead to some surprisingly interesting chess, and I hope that the games I show you today will inspire you to reconsider and perhaps look deeper into the mysterious b4. In our first game, we will see the game Schiffler, Pinkerneil. In this game, of course, White started with the move b4, and Black decided to respond with the most common move, e5. White continues with the logical bishop to b2, and Black plays the third most common move here. Most common is for the pawns to be exchanged with bishop takes b4 and bishop takes e5, after which White has successfully traded a flank pawn for a center pawn. However, Black will have a lead in tempo and development. The second most common move is d6, defending the e5 pawn. This is known as the check defense. However, here we see a surprisingly critical line, f6, also defending the e5 pawn, but instead of doing it with d6, doing it with the f pawn. Here, the most common moves are b5 and a3, both of which I have played. However, there's a very interesting gambit which continues with the move e4. This is known as the Tartakower gambit, and this is how our game continues. After this, the most principled reply is to, of course, accept the gambit and play bishop takes b4. However, Black decided to come up with an interesting idea and played a novelty, c6. c6 is clearly aiming to push the d pawn to d5 and challenge White's push into the center with e4. This undermines a lot of the gambit compensation that White may try to get after bishop takes b4 and bishop c4. However, it misses a potentially practically deadly sacrifice. Bishop takes e5. While the engine doesn't give a crazy evaluation for this position, White will have a lot of practical chances here, and Black will need to be quite accurate to continue the game without getting checkmated. Okay, of course you have to accept the bishop. F takes e5. White continues with queen h5 check. If you block with the g pawn, you lose your rook to queen e5, queen takes e5 check, queen e7, and queen takes h8. So Black plays the only other move, king e7. After this, White plays the very natural queen takes e5 check. Black plays their only move, king f7. And now White continues with bishop c4 check. In this position, Black can run away from the attack with an advantage after the move d5. And after e takes d5, it's important that Black finds the move bishop d6, attacking the queen. This line is relatively complicated and hard to calculate, as White can play a move like d takes c6 check, and after king f8, you have to see that after c takes b7, you're completely winning here. However, Black did not find this move and played a blunder. King to g6. Now White's attack is going to be allowed to continue with quite a bit of deadliness. White continues with the move knight to h3. White had a more accurate way to win, and that was with the move queen f5 check. I'll show you some lines for your personal enjoyment. King to h6, and then White would continue with the move g4. Aiming to push the pawn further and deliver some nasty checks to the king, or to play queen to h5 checkmate. If Black were to try to generate some lift for their king with the move g6, then we see the following line, g5 check. You have to take with the queen. If you don't take with the queen, then king h5, bishop e2 check, king h4, and queen g4 checkmate. So queen takes g5, after which the bishop hangs, queen takes bishop, king h5, bishop e2 check, king h4, and white wins the queen. If that isn't enough for you, black is actually also getting mated. King h5, knight takes g5 check, king takes g5, and the very visually appealing h4 checkmate. However, white still found another move, another attacking move, which was able to retain an advantage here. Knight h3. The threat is, of course, to bring the knight to f4. Black continued with the move d5, however, it's already too late. Knight to f4 check, king f7. If king h6, the only other legal move, then of course queen h5 is checkmate. So king h7, e takes d5. White is entirely winning here, and the attack is crushing. White is threatening to continue with both the moves c6 and d6, check. However, here black expedited the losing process by blundering their queen in one move with queen to e7. If you'd like to solve the puzzle, please pause the video and take a few seconds. For those of you who are sticking around, it's d6 check, and of course the king is under check and the queen is attacked. So black is losing their queen. If a move like b5 here to try to distract the bishop, white isn't worried. White can play the move knight e6, which is winning, however very complicated, or perhaps the more natural and still very winning bishop to b3. Now we will move on to the second game. In this game, we see Grosch Grabenhorst. While this isn't a particularly important game, it does highlight one of the craziest lines which can emerge from the first move, b4. In this game, black also replied with e5, white continued with bishop to b2, and black captured the b4 pawn. Here, as I mentioned previously, the most common move is for white to take back the e5 pawn, after which the game is roughly equal. However, there does exist a very interesting gambit here, the name of which I cannot pronounce, with f4. The idea behind f4 is to distract the e5 pawn away from the long diagonal and allow white to capture with the bishop on g7 and win the rook. The most common way to play against this, and essentially the way to easily neutralize it, is d6. After f takes e5, d takes e5, bishop takes e5, black has a healthy advantage. However, to play in true gambit spirit, black can accept the pawn with e takes f4, which is also a theoretical move. Here, white continues with bishop takes g7, and it appears that black has just hung the rook. However, white is going to get a tremendous amount of compensation with a kingside attack. Here we see the theoretical line, queen to h4 check. White plays the only move, g3. Black plays f takes g3, and white continues with bishop to g2. In this position, black is threatening to push the pawn to g2 with check, and take the rook, after which promoting to a new queen. In fact, in this position, if black was able to move again, this would actually be checkmate. White plays bishop to g2. This also opens up the f1 square for the king. Black continues with g takes h2 check, king to f1, h takes g1 queen, king takes queen, and here we see a very interesting position. After the queen moves, and then white takes the rook on h8, we can count the material and find that, well, white is up in exchange in terms of pieces, black has the two pawns to compensate for it, and white has a relatively weak king. If black were to play the more principled move, queen to c4, and then white were to continue with bishop takes rook, white would have a very slight edge in this position, however it would be roughly equal, and could lead to some very interesting games. However, it turns out that queen to f4 was actually a terrible mistake. One of the problems that black has here is being able to hold on to their pawns, particularly on the king's side. The h7 pawn is very weak, and if white is able to trade queens, the weakness of white's king is not going to matter in the long run. So if white can trade queens here, white can look forward to a healthy advantage, where the exchange is going to dominate the board. Queen to f4 allows a queen exchange to happen later on. I'll demonstrate now. Black continued with the move, f6, attempting to block in the bishop, and now we see the problem with queen f4. e3. The queen is wanting to jump into h5 with check, and you don't have time to properly block it as the queen is attacked. If the queen was on c4, a really good move in this position would be queen to f7, after which the game would continue to be roughly equal. However, here, black is in a lot of trouble. Black has to stop the check on h5 with their queen. Otherwise, for example, if black plays queen to c4, trying to correct their mistake now, we would see queen to h5 check, queen to f7, queen takes f7 check, king takes f7, bishop to d5 check, and after king to f8, rook takes h7, and the black king is absolutely hopeless. If we want to look a bit further, we could see after a move like knight to c6, we would see a very nice finish, bishop to d7 check, king to e7, bishop takes g8, and white has one apiece in the corner. If instead of knight to c6, black were to try saving this knight by bringing it to e7, then bishop to g7 check, king to e8, and rook to e8, or rook to h8 rather, check, is just going to win the knight. After blocking, of course, white would take. Okay, so white plays queen to f5, and after queen to h5 check, queen takes h5, rook to h5, black simply resigned. The problem is, this bishop is never going to get trapped, and these pawns are too weak in the long run. If black were to try to continue to trap the bishop, for example, right now white is threatening to take the pawn on h7, so if black were to save that pawn and try to eventually march the king in to take the bishop with the move h6, then white could continue with bishop to d5. Next move, white is going to take the knight, and then be able to play bishop takes here. And there's not really anything that black can do about it. If the knight moves here, for example, we could just slide our bishop back, and we're still controlling the knight from going back to that square, and if they attempt to block off our bishop, well, this pawn would be hanging. Now we will move on to our third game. This is the first of two games we will look at where white was played by Alexei Sokolsky. Sokolsky is the namesake of this opening, the Sokolsky Opening, and surely its most prolific player ever. Most of the theory that we have on b4 today is thanks to Sokolsky, and many of the opening's most important games were played by him. Of course, Sokolsky opened with b4. We see e5, bishop to b2, f6, and again the Tartakower Gambit with e4. If the Tartakower Gambit interests you, there's a wonderful video made by Agadmator where he covers a simul game where Bobby Fischer was successfully able to apply this opening to win very nicely. I'll link that in the description. Here, black accepts the gambit with bishop takes b4, and white played bishop to c4, attempting to gain some compensation on the light squares. We see knight to c6, and a very strong move, f4. This is in an attempt to destabilize black's strong e5 pawn. However, it looks like white just gave up a pawn for free. Black plays e takes f4, however white is going to win it back easily with knight to h3. Black played knight g to e7. However, let's take a look at what happens if black tries to hold on to the pawn with g5. g5, white is going to gain a crushing attack with queen to h5 check. After king e7, queen f7 check, king to d6, white can play the amazing move knight takes g5. If the sacrificed knight is accepted, then black is simply getting mated in several moves after e5 check. Even if the knight isn't accepted, white's attack is completely crushing, and the black king is hopeless. In our game, of course, we saw knight g to e7. and white continued with knight takes f4, recapturing their pawn. Here, black decided to attack the light squared bishop with knight to a5. A normal chess player would find a way to move or protect this bishop. However, one hanging bishop was not enough for Sokolsky, so with a very deep understanding of this position, he played the brilliant move, bishop takes f6, now hanging two bishops. Black played rook to f8. Let's take a look at what happens after black accepts either of the bishops. If black takes the dark squared bishop with g takes f6, then we would see queen to h5 check, knight to g6. Of course, if king to f8 instead of knight to g6, black gets mated in one turn. So knight to g6, knight takes g6, and due to the discoveries, the black king is absolutely helpless. White is winning here. If knight takes c4, accepting the light squared bishop, we would see queen to h5 check, g6, knight takes g6, knight takes g6 is the only move. The discoveries which white is threatening are absolutely deadly, so black has to give up the queen, and white is completely winning here as well. In the game we saw rook to f8, and white continued with knight to h5. If white was able to move again here, white would play knight takes g7 checkmate. However, we see that both of white's bishops are hanging yet again. Let's take a look at what happens if black tries to take the dark squared bishop. If rook takes f6, then we would see knight takes f6 check, g takes f6, queen h5 check, knight to g6, and then the amazing bishop to f7 check. After king takes f7, queen h7 check. Black is going to lose their knight, and even though white is down a considerable amount of material, the weakness of black's king actually makes this position evaluated at a severe advantage for white. Of course, if you attempt to accept the dark squared bishop with the g-pawn, then the previously mentioned checkmate would arrive with knight to g7 checkmate. Notice how white's light squared bishop is doing a very good job preventing the black king from escaping to the f7 square. Noticing this, black played the move knight takes c4, accepting the other bishop. White continues with the logical knight takes g7 check, and after king to f7, the only move, white played castles in the style of Morphy, bringing all the pieces into the attack. By doing this, the white rook is now suddenly attacking the king, and the white bishop is protected. Wanting to avoid discovered checks along the f-file, black played king to g8, and white continued by bringing more pieces into the attack with queen to h5. Here, black is under a lot of pressure, and decided to give back an exchange to attempt to avert some of white's deadly attack. We see rook takes f6, rook takes f6. Of course, if after rook takes f6, the king tries to take the hanging knight, then we would see rook f2 check, king h8, and queen takes h7 checkmate. So after rook takes f6, black decided to continue with knight to g6. Here, white decided to give back the exchange to continue their crushing attack. Rook takes g6, h takes g6, and queen takes g6. Here, the black king is in a lot of trouble, and white is threatening discoveries such as knight to e6 check, which are going to absolutely devastate black. Black decided to play king to h8, and white continued with a really amazing move, knight to e8. Here, black can attempt to survive if they have another move by bringing the black queen in to help protect. However, the move knight to e8 restricts the black queen from going to the f8 and g8 squares. Of course, white is threatening the move queen to g7 checkmate, and black has to defend against this. Black played queen to e7. If instead black attempts to play bishop to f8, white of course has a perpetual after queen to h5 check, king to g8, queen to g6 check, king to h8. But if white wants to play for more of an advantage, they can play the move knight to c3. Even though white is down a lot of material, and this attack seems too slow to work, it is actually crushing, and the engine evaluates this as mate in 14, with white's knight coming to the f6 square, and the white rook coming to the f1 square. Of course, in our game, we saw queen to e7, and white played a move that forced black to resign. This move was knight to f6. Unfortunately for black, there is no way to stop both queen to h7 checkmate and queen to g8 checkmate without giving up black's queen. Of course, if you attempt to continue with the move queen to g7, seems like the only logical response which prevents both checkmates, then we would see some sort of Arabian mate with queen to h5 check, forcing queen to h7, and then queen takes h7 checkmate. Now we will look at our fourth game. The last two games we're going to look at are absolute classics of this opening. In this one, we see white as Sokolsky yet again, and black is Krupsky. Sokolsky opens with b4, and black replies with d5. Slightly less common than e5, however still a very popular reply. White plays bishop to b2, and black plays queen to d6. This is a surprisingly critical response that I found when I was doing some preparation for this opening for tournaments, and white needs to continue very carefully as black is going to gain some very commanding control over the center. White continues with a3, protecting the b4 pawn, and we see e5, taking the center as I mentioned before. White continues with knight to f3, attacking the e5 pawn, and black defends it with knight to d7. Here Sokolsky wanted to prepare the c4 pawn break and get his light squared bishop open, and thus played e3. Black played bishop to e7, wanting to get the kingside pieces out and castle as quickly as possible. Sokolsky played c4. Wanting to retain the two pawns in the center, Krupsky decided to play c6, aiming that after c takes d5, he could recapture with the c pawn and enjoy his central control. We see c takes d5, c takes d5, and one of the things that you'll notice looking at Sokolsky games, particularly in the first 20 moves after he opens with b4, is his intense ability to hone in on black's positional and tactical weaknesses like a heat-seeking missile. Sokolsky correctly identifies that the c-file is a massive problem for black, and a knight going to b5 would be the end of the game. He continues with knight to c3. The aim, of course, is knight to b5, after which forks are threatened on c7, which can later be supported by a rook on c1. Black played a terrible move here, bishop to f6, not realizing the amount of danger that they were in. White continues with knight to b5, attacking the queen. Black protects the queen while also retaining defense of the c7 square by playing queen to b8. And here, white continues with rook to c1. Rook to c1 renews the threat of knight to c7 check, which would fork and win in exchange. So black logically decided to defend against it with bishop to d8. However, this is a terrible blunder. This is a very nice puzzle, and I highly encourage you to pause the video and attempt to find the move which Sokolsky was able to play and force resignation in this position. For those of you who stuck around, Sokolsky played the amazing move rook takes c8, taking a bishop for free and trapping the black queen. Of course, if black takes the rook, which is the only variation worth looking at, then white ends up winning with knight d6 check, forking the king and the queen. What a wonderful game. Now we will move on to our last game. Luckily for you, I've saved the best for last. This is my personal favorite, Chrenyshov Lesiak. In this game, of course, we see b4. Black replies with e6. White plays bishop to b2. If black attempts to take the pawn on b4, they'll lose very quickly to bishop takes g7, and the rook on h8 is trapped. This is actually a very common tactic which leads to a lot of wins at the lower levels, and is a trap which gained me a lot of rating points when I was around the 1000 range. Instead, of course, in our game, black plays knight to f6. This is a relatively common and quite safe setup for black to play against b4. White continues with a3, protecting the b4 pawn, and black plays bishop to e7, attempting to castle as quickly as possible. We see e3, opening up the light-squared bishop, and castles. Now, in this position, white played bishop to d3, which looks a bit off to a typical b4 player. The bishop very rarely goes to this square, as white typically wants to push the d-pawn. The bishop is often better suited on the e2 square, however in this game, white had some ambitious attacking ideas. We see h6, and knight to f3. Here, black wants to improve their pieces, and finds that the best way to do that is to fianchetto the light-squared bishop. Black plays b6, and white continues with a very interesting move, g4. g4 is a very exciting pawn gambit. If knight takes g4, then white would play rook g1, and the attack can branch off in many ways and get very interesting here. Even though white is down a pawn, the engine gives equality here, and I would much prefer to have white in this position. Instead in the game, black played the considerably safer bishop to b7, pinning white's knight to the rook on h1. Here, white played a move which must have confused black, g5. Black, of course, thinks that this pawn is simply hanging and takes it, h takes g5. What's going on here? The knight on f3 is obviously pinned to the rook on h1 and can't take the pawn. Or so he thought. We see knight takes g5, giving up the rook on h1. Black, of course, has to accept this. Bishop takes h1, and white continues with bishop takes f6. Here, black must have realized some of the trouble that they'd gotten themselves into. If you take the bishop with either bishop takes f6 or g takes f6, you're going to see queen to h5 on the next move in either of these positions, and unfortunately for black, due to the combination of protection on the h7 square from white's knight and the bishop, there's no way to stop the white queen from arriving on h7 with immediate checkmate or checkmate to soon follow. Instead, black deduced that, okay, I lost a piece, but I did win white's rook. So I'll play g6, not immediately capturing the bishop on f6. Here, white played one of the most amazing moves I've ever seen. This is a very nice puzzle, and I implore you to please pause the video and try to find it for yourself. For the rest of you, I'll show you the move. Queen to h5. What an amazing move. Reminds me of the finishes that Tal would apply onto weaker players who were unfortunate enough to face him. Of course, in this position, white is threatening queen to h7 checkmate and queen to h8 checkmate. It's impossible to stop both of these without taking the queen, so of course black would have to take the queen, and after taking the queen, we would see a very rare mating pattern, Blackburn's mate, with bishop to h7 checkmate. And white's dark-squared and light-squared bishops team up quite nicely to checkmate the black's king with support from white's knight on g5. The last two games I showed you, as well as another very lovely game, are featured in an orangutan miniatures video by Chess with Sauron. Please go check it out, I'll leave a link in the description. Other than that, I hope that the games I showed you today have inspired you to take a deeper look into b4, perhaps try it out in some of your games. I do stream chess on twitch.tv/bakedegg5 if you're interested. Other than that, happy checkmating and have an excellent day.